Thanks very much to the organizers for what's already been an extremely interesting conversation and for inviting me to be a part of it. As you may have seen in my bio, I worked for a couple of years as a legal advisor to the Palestinian team in the peace talks that began in 1999 and culminated, if that's the right word, in the Camp David and Taba rounds. My route to that job was facilitated by two unlikely parties. The first of them was actually the British government, which paid our salaries for those 2 years, in part, I think, because they had been convinced of the importance of Palestinians having decent lawyers at the table after the Oslo debacle. And perhaps as well out of a measure of guilt about what happened earlier in the century. But the other person who facilitated my being able to take the job was actually the architect of the Oslo Accords, an Israeli lawyer named Yoel Zinger, who was of counsel at my law firm, Sidley & Austin, in Washington, D.C., during the time just before I left to go to Palestine. When I was invited to go and take the job, the managing partner of my firm was hesitant to allow me to do it. It was a busy period at that time. Yoel intervened on my behalf and said, Carter, it would be good for the firm to have someone on both sides. So I thanked him, and sometime later there was a cocktail party to see me off. And I introduced Yoel to my paralegal as the man who wrote the agreement that we would be working to undo. And he turned to me and he said, is that what you're doing? And I said, it is a self-consciously temporary arrangement, no? And he said, and I'll stop with my terrible Israeli accent, he said, let me tell you a story. And forgive me, this is a colorful story. A man goes to the doctor because his private parts have turned black. The doctor tells him, we'll have to amputate. The man, alarmed, seeks a second opinion. Sadly, the second doctor he consults offers the same prognosis, as does the third, the fourth, and the fifth. Seeking any alternative, he decides to consult a practitioner of Chinese medicine. He waits in the office, and eventually, after a thorough inspection, the Chinese doctor is ready to pronounce on the result. And the man says, will you have to amputate? And the Chinese doctor says, no. And the guy breathes a sigh of relief. And then the doctor says, it will fall off on its own. I have puzzled over that story for years, and I'm still not sure what it means. My sense is that our Israeli counterparts entered permanent status negotiations with a rather different view of what we were undertaking than we had. I'm not sure that they understood that it would lead to a decisive transformation in arrangements on the ground. But I don't think that even Yoel could have anticipated how durable the arrangements that he crafted 25 years ago would turn out to be. Oslo has turned black, but it hasn't fallen off. In the time I have today, I'd like to discuss the policy that, to my mind, is at the very center of the arrangements that were defined 25 years ago and that continue to shape the political geography, particularly of the West Bank, but truly of all of the occupied territory to this day. The name of that policy in Hebrew is hafrada, which is translated differently depending on whom you ask. Some define it as separation, some as segregation. Critics analogize it to apartheid. Ehud Barak, a long-standing advocate, offered the following explanation. Israelis, he said, should separate ourselves from the Palestinians physically, following the recommendation of the American poet Robert Frost, who once wrote that good fences make good neighbors. Leave them behind, outside the borders that will be agreed upon, and build Israel. Ignoring Barak's terrible misappropriation of Robert Frost, who was anything but a believer in fences, his vision of hafrada, of separation, evokes both physical segregation and self-determination by erecting a border that keeps Palestinians out. Israelis will be free, finally, to build Israel. The desire for physical separation emerged as a leading driver of Israeli support for a two-state solution following the commencement of Palestinian-Israeli peace talks in the early 1990s, particularly, ironically, among those on the left of Israel's political spectrum. Recall that in Israel's 1992 elections, just prior to the inception of the Oslo process, the Labour Party captured the premiership with the slogan, "Us here, them there, peace with Rabin." And the slogan was reprised by Ehud Barak in his successful 1999 campaign. Its appeal can be attributed to a range of factors, and many, unsurprisingly, tend to focus on security among them. Dan Shefton, an influential advisor to successive Israeli governments and one of the leading proponents of the idea, says that it's made imperative by inexorable Arab hostility to Jews. But my sense is that security is not the only thing driving this policy. In a sense, echoing Professor Pape in his earlier remarks, Professor Amnon Raz-Chakotzin at Ben Gurion University submits that in the eyes of Israelis, the peace process is not perceived as the basis for reconciliation founded on Palestinian rights and mutual recognition, but rather as a way to dispose of the territories in order to get rid of the Arabs. Rather than a clear political stance, the support of peace is a cultural position which emphasizes the need for a homogeneous Jewish state. Whatever its motivations, the goal of separation has had a profound influence on Israeli government policy over the last 2 decades, among other things, inspiring the construction of the West Bank barrier, which, as you know, has been dubbed the separation fence, and Israel's disengagement from the Gaza Strip. It's also possible to discern its imprint on Israeli negotiating positions regarding a range of major issues: rejection of Palestinian refugee return outside the narrow frame of family reunification, the gerrymandering of the border to maximize the number of Jews and minimize the number of Palestinians annexed to Israel, opposition to making Jerusalem an open city with free access by both Israelis and Palestinians, and more broadly, support for a hard border between the two states, with rigorous controls on the cross-border movement of persons. During the talks recently facilitated by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, Prime Minister Netanyahu strayed from the separation model to a limited extent, suggesting that settlers could be permitted to live in a Palestinian state. Unsurprisingly, however, his embrace of pluralism did not extend to Palestinian refugees, whom he urged to give up your dream of the right of return. Over the last 2 years, we've seen the principle of separation elevated further. With the nation-state law, Israel has abandoned the pretense of being a liberal democracy premised on pluralism in favor of a narrow nationalist self-conception of Israel as the site for self-determination for only one people. And separation has been paired with an unvarnished effort to transform de facto annexation of substantial parts of the West Bank into a legal reality. Although Palestinians, for their part, have not explicitly embraced physical separation from Israelis as a framework for partition, it has colored our approach to a range of issues, particularly refugees and settlements. In view of the time, I won't go into a lot of detail with respect to that, but one of the things that is most alarming is to see the gradual transformation in the Palestinian position. Whereas at the outset, it was understood, as Nadia pointed out earlier in her presentation, that refugee return could be reconcilable with the idea of a two-state solution. The premise being that you would have two heterogeneous states on each side of the Green Line. That idea has increasingly been abandoned, and we see by the most recent round of negotiations Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, undertaking to reassure Netanyahu that Palestinians will not seek to flood Israel with refugees to change its social character. Similarly, whereas the international community also spurned the idea of separation in its earliest vision for two states, the UN General Assembly's partition plan in 1947, which very explicitly and emphatically was committed to the protection of minorities within each of the two states. The international community, too, has hewn increasingly over time to the logic of separation. We saw that certainly represented in the Clinton ideas. We saw that, I'll be quick. We saw that reflected in President Obama's approach to issues ranging from Jerusalem to recognizing as Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. And most recently, we see it in President Trump's advocacy of a solution, a deal that would involve permanently severing Gaza's 1.8 million Palestinians from both the West Bank and Israel, connecting Palestinian cantons in the West Bank to Jordan, and the permanent resettlement of refugees in third countries. I have more that I would love to say about the ways in which this dynamic needs challenging, but I will close by just offering 2 quick points. The first of those points is that if we are serious about amputating Oslo, then it is absolutely critical that we challenge the vision of separation that undergirds it. Separation is fundamental to the Oslo framework. But the second thing that I'd like to say is that to make that point doesn't necessarily mean that one must embrace a particular vision of a solution for Israel-Palestine, a single democratic state, for example. Like Sir Richard, I'm intrigued by some of the propositions that have been explored recently around confederation, and think that they offer an opportunity to reconcile self-determination with a vision of two liberal states operating side by side within a framework of freedom of movement. I'm happy to talk more about any of that, but for now,